They said he could never be a father, but destiny rarely asks for permission. New York was drowning in rain that evening. Sheets of water drummed against the glass facade of Sterling Tower, turning the skyline into a watercolor blur. From the top floor, Xavier Sterling stood before the window, watching the city vanish beneath a curtain of silver. His reflection stared back impeccably, dressed perfectly composed and utterly hollow. It had been 3 months since the divorce. 3 months since his wife No. His ex-wife had turned a gala ballroom into a courtroom. She'd held her champagne flute like a dagger, her smile gleaming as she sliced him open with 10 perfect words. A man who can't create life has no right to lead one. Laughter. Flashbulbs. Headlines. The next morning, the infertile CEO. The whispers had followed him like smoke ever since. Xavier's fingers tightened around the edge of his desk. Once that same hand had signed billion-dollar deals, rebuilt skylines, reshaped destinies. Now it trembled not from weakness, but from the effort of holding himself together. He'd built this tower as a monument to power, 92 stories of glass and ambition that scraped the sky. Yet tonight, it felt more like a tomb, a monument to everything he'd lost: dignity, marriage, and the quiet hope of ever hearing a child call him father. He exhaled slowly, the sound merging with the steady hum of rain. The city below glittered faintly, as if mocking him with its pulse of life. He needed to leave before the walls started talking back. The elevator descended in silence, mirrors reflecting his face from every angle, each one colder than the last. When the doors slid open, chaos met him. A gust of wind had followed a woman inside, scattering a storm of papers across the marble lobby. Architectural drawings, ink bleeding in the rain, and in the center of it all, a woman chasing her pages like someone trying to catch pieces of her own heart. She was soaked curls clinging to her cheeks, her charcoal dress plastered to her skin. Yet her posture, straight defiant, carried a quiet grace that made everything else fade. Oh God, I'm so sorry, she stammered, kneeling to gather the drenched sheets. The revolving door caught the wind. Xavier bent to help her without a word. Their hands brushed over the same page, and for the first time in weeks, his pulse stumbled. The drawing between them was extraordinary, an angular design of glass and steel, yet somehow warm, alive. A sun-shaped atrium beams, bending the light into the pattern of a heart. He looked at her. You believe light can pass through steel and concrete? She met his gaze, rain sliding down her jaw like diamonds. Her eyes, amber with flecks of gold, held his calm and certain. If you put it in the right place, she said softly, even darkness can be illuminated. The words pierced something in him, something long buried beneath cynicism and pride. Do you work for Anderson and Associates? He asked, recognizing the portfolio's insignia. For now, she said, her voice lilting with an easy honesty. At least until they realize I showed up looking like a hurricane. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, his first in months. I'd say the hurricane left behind something remarkable. He gestured toward the soaked blueprints. These designs, they breathe. She blinked in surprise, then smiled a small, genuine curve that made the entire lobby seem brighter. You actually looked at them? Of course I did. I build towers for a living. And I build places for people to live inside them, she countered. Something in her tone, unapologetic, intelligent, quietly proud, cut through his defenses. Xavier Sterling. He introduced himself, extending his hand. She hesitated before taking it. Her grip was firm, professional. Aisha Rivers, architect. Their handshake lingered a heartbeat longer than necessary. Later he would remember the details in fragments, the sound of her laughter echoing against marble, the scent of rain and coffee that clung to her the way she brushed her wet curls back with the back of her wrist, unbothered by the dozen eyes watching her. When she left, he found one page still on the floor, a design titled, "The Light Between." It was signed in neat handwriting, A. Rivers. He folded it carefully and slipped it into his briefcase, though he couldn't explain why. That night, the storm refused to leave. Lightning streaked across Manhattan as Xavier sat in his penthouse staring at the forgotten drawing. He should have been reviewing reports, answering investor emails, pretending to be the man the world still believed he was. Instead, he traced the lines she'd drawn: the atrium, the light paths, the open space where people could stand beneath the sun. It was ridiculous, he told himself. Just a chance encounter. A woman with talent and rain in her hair. But her words wouldn't leave him. If you put it in the right place, even darkness can be illuminated. He'd spent years putting his energy into the wrong places, into towers instead of homes, deals instead of people, pride instead of peace. And now a stranger's voice echoed in his mind like a prayer. He poured himself a glass of scotch, staring out at the city. The rain had eased, leaving the streets glistening under streetlights. He wondered where she was, if she'd dried off, if her drawings were salvageable, if she even knew how much her brief smile had shifted the weight inside his chest. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was everything. Down in the street below, Aisha Rivers walked briskly through the wet night, portfolio hugged to her chest. Her shoes squelched with every step, but her mind was elsewhere, on the tall, brooding man who'd looked at her designs as if he'd seen himself in them. She had recognized him instantly. Everyone in architecture knew Xavier Sterling, the visionary who turned urban wastelands into skylines. But the man she'd met wasn't the legend from magazines. There had been something fragile in his composure, like a mirror about to crack. And those eyes, cold until they weren't. She smiled despite herself. It had been years since anyone made her heart stutter like that. Still, she reminded herself, she had no space for distractions. Not when she was fighting to prove that a black woman from New Orleans could rise in a world built by old white men with deeper pockets and older prejudices. And yet, something about the encounter felt less like coincidence and more like an unfinished sentence. By midnight, the city was quiet again. Xavier sat at his piano, untouched since the divorce, and pressed a tentative key. The note hung in the air, uncertain, wavering before settling into silence. He thought of his father's voice, the one that haunted him whenever he faltered. A sterling man builds his own destiny. Never let them see you break. But tonight, he wasn't sure if breaking was the same as feeling. He closed the lid of the piano and walked back to the window. Far below, the world glimmered with reflections, streetlights caught in puddles, headlights slicing through mist. Each drop of rain carried a shimmer of light. Maybe she was right. Maybe even steel could shine if the light found its way in. His phone buzzed. A message from his assistant, Anderson and Associates, scheduled to present their proposal tomorrow, 9 a.m. Xavier stared at the name, then at the folded sketch beside him, A. Rivers. He exhaled a sound between disbelief and quiet hope. "Then let's see," he murmured to himself, sliding the drawing into a new folder, if lightning really can strike twice. Outside, a final streak of light split the night sky, brief, brilliant, gone. But in its wake, the city glowed. And somewhere between the rain and the reflection, a man who had lost faith began unknowingly to believe again. A week later, Aisha Rivers stood before the towering glass facade of Sterling Industries. The sunlight glared against the mirrored surface, making her reflection look smaller, thinner, like she was about to walk into the heart of something that could swallow her whole. She took a breath and stepped inside. The elevator rose in silence, its metallic hum syncing with her pulse. Her portfolio felt heavy against her arm, Heavier than it should maybe, because she knew this meeting wasn't just about design. It was about being seen. When the doors opened onto the 92nd floor, the world seemed to expand. The room was all glass and light, Manhattan glittering below like a sea of silver and smoke. And there he was, Xavier Sterling. He stood by the massive window, sunlight spilling across the charcoal lines of his suit. He didn't turn right away. He was looking at the city as though trying to decode it. When he finally did, his voice was quiet, almost reflective. "Do you believe buildings can heal people?" Ms. Rivers. Aisha didn't hesitate. "If they're built with compassion, yes. A home can make a man remember he's human." He smiled, faint, almost involuntary. It was the kind of smile that revealed how long he'd forgotten what warmth felt like. They began working together that afternoon. The project, Sustainable Horizon, a new housing development for lower-income families. For him, it was a way to reshape Sterling Industries' reputation after months of scandal. For her, it was a chance to prove that beauty didn't belong only to the rich. But somewhere between the blueprints and late-night strategy meetings, something unspoken began to take root. Aisha noticed things. The way Xavier's hand hovered over the same architectural line again and again, as if afraid of erasing what was left of himself. The way his eyes sometimes unfocused, lost in some private ache. He noticed her too, how she treated each drawing like a heartbeat, how she could argue a technical flaw with such grace that even defiance sounded like music. At first, their conversations were purely professional. Then they began to wander into cities they both loved, books that had saved them the quiet loneliness that came with ambition. And always the light, how it moved through space, how it transformed what it touched. One evening, they stayed long after the team had gone. The office was dim-lit only by the glow of city lights and the pale halo from a single desk lamp. Aisha sipped cold coffee, scrolling through her presentation. "You know," she said, glancing at him, "everyone talks about Sterling Tower as a masterpiece of design. But what I see—" She hesitated. He looked up from the blueprint spread before him. "What do you see, Ms. Rivers?" "A man trying to build something tall enough to outgrow his loneliness." The words hung between them, too intimate, too true. For a heartbeat, he said nothing. Then slowly, he leaned back in his chair, eyes softening. "Maybe some loneliness," he admitted, "isn't meant to be outgrown. Maybe we build towers, so we don't have to let anyone close enough to see it." Aisha studied him, the tension in his jaw, the faint exhaustion under his eyes. The tabloids had painted him as ruthless, arrogant, unfeeling. But in that moment she saw something else, a man terrified of his own silence. "You don't have to be the tower," she said quietly. "You can be the light inside it." For a long time neither moved. Outside the city shimmered reflections on glass rainbows caught in steel. Over the next few weeks, their work intensified. The Sustainable Horizon project became their shared obsession. The board wanted numbers. He wanted redemption. She wanted beauty that served purpose. Together they created something extraordinary, spaces where sunlight could reach even the smallest corners, where glass walls didn't separate, but connected. When Aisha spoke about her design philosophy, every home should feel like a promise kept. Xavier found himself listening, not as a CEO, but as a man rediscovering what promises felt like. She was unlike anyone he'd met, unflinching in the face of power, but never cruel, driven, but never hardened. At times he caught himself watching her reflection in the glass, more than the skyline beyond it. The world outside looked colder now, knowing she was inside it. One night, after a particularly grueling meeting, the team finally dispersed. Only the two of them remained. The air was heavy with fatigue, and something else neither dared name. Aisha walked to the window, her reflection merging with the city lights below. "You know," she murmured, people see this tower as your empire, but they don't see the man standing alone inside it. Her voice was soft, but sure, the kind of voice that didn't demand truth, only offered space for it. Xavier's breath caught. He joined her by the glass, the distance between them vanishing until he could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. Some loneliness, he said, finally isn't about being unseen. It's about being seen too clearly and finding out no one stays. Aisha turned to face him. Her eyes reflected both light and sorrow, and for a second he thought he might drown in them. Then maybe she whispered, "You've been looking in the wrong direction." The silence that followed was not empty. It pulsed, like two souls recognizing the echo of their own heartbeat in another. He wanted to say something, anything to break the current pulling him toward her, but the words refused to come. Instead, he reached for the window switch, and the automatic blinds slid open fully. The skyline flared to life, golden endless. Manhattan glowed beneath them, and for the first time in years, Xavier didn't see a city to conquer. He saw a world still capable of beauty. He turned to Aisha, the glass reflecting them both. Her face, his face, two shadows wrapped in light. "It's strange," he said quietly. "I built this tower to touch the sky, but somehow you make it feel closer to the ground." Her lips curved, not into a smile, but something softer, more dangerous. "That's where people live, Mr. Sterling." The blinds clicked shut again, but the light remained between them, within them impossible to ignore. Later that night, as Aisha packed her things, she caught her reflection in the window. The city behind her was alive, its lights pulsing like 1,000 beating hearts. For the first time since she'd moved to New York, she didn't feel like a visitor looking in. She felt like she belonged, not because of the project or the praise, but because someone had looked at her and really seen her. Still, she reminded herself, be careful. He was her boss, her benefactor, her opposite in every possible way. But her heart, foolish, impatient, whispered back, and yet. Across the city, Xavier couldn't sleep. He sat by the piano again, fingers tracing keys without pressing them. His mind played its own melody, fragments of her voice, the sound of her laughter, the way she'd looked at him when she said he wasn't alone. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe there was more to him than broken promises and empty floors of glass. Outside, dawn began to rise, gold bleeding into gray. He stood by the window watching light spill across the city, the same light she'd spoken of, the one that could reach even the hardest surfaces if placed right. And somewhere deep inside, something stirred. Not quite hope, but something close. He glanced at the folder on his desk, Sustainable Horizon. Tomorrow they'd present it to the board. Tomorrow the world would see her work. A faint smile crossed his face. Maybe, he murmured to the empty room, light really can pass through steel. Night had folded itself over New York like silk. Outside, the rain had softened to a whisper, brushing against the windows of the 92nd floor, where light still glowed long after the rest of the building had gone dark. Aisha stood before the glass wall, her reflection blending with the city beneath her, rivers of light, winding through the grid headlights, flickering like fireflies over the Hudson. The quiet felt sacred, almost dangerous, the kind that invited confessions. Behind her, the elevator doors sighed open. Xavier Sterling stepped out, 2 cups of coffee in hand. His tie was loosened, the sharp edge of his suit softened by the hour. "Still here?" he asked, his voice low. She smiled without turning around. "Couldn't sleep." "Neither could I," he said, setting 1 cup beside her. Their reflections stood side by side on the glass, the distance between them narrowing with every shared silence. Aisha lifted her cup. "You don't usually invite people to stay this late." A shadow of amusement crossed his lips. "Maybe I just never met someone who made the night feel shorter." The words hung there, half a joke, half a truth too fragile to touch. They didn't talk for a while. The hum of the city filled the space between them. Traffic murmurs below the faint whistle of wind through steel. The rain traced thin veins of silver down the glass, each drop catching the light. Finally, Aisha broke the silence. When I was little, my father used to wake me up before sunrise. He'd say, "The world is softer before the noise begins." We'd sit on the porch waiting for the first light. Our house was small, leaky roof peeling paint. But when the sun hit it just right, it looked golden. He taught me that beauty isn't about wealth. It's about where you let the light in. Her voice trembled slightly on that last line. Xavier looked at her, and something inside him tightened a knot he hadn't realized he'd been carrying since boyhood. He had never spoken of his parents, not to the press, not to friends, not even to the woman he'd once married. But now, standing in front of this woman with eyes that could see through stone, he found the words slipping out unbidden. "My parents died when I was 17. Car accident. I built this tower with the insurance money. People said it was ambition. It was just survival. I thought if I built something tall enough, I'd stop feeling so small." He paused, his voice quieter now. But I was wrong. The higher I went, the lonelier it got. Aisha turned to him, the city lights painting her face in amber and shadow. "You're not the only one who hides behind the things you build," she said softly. He met her gaze. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like the man in control. The storm outside began again, slow, deliberate, like the heartbeat of the night. Aisha set down her coffee and stepped closer to the glass. "You're afraid of being seen as weak." He exhaled a sound that was half a laugh, half defeat. "I'm afraid of being seen as empty." She turned to him, eyes tender but unyielding. "Then fill the emptiness with something real." The distance between them vanished, not because one moved, but because both stopped resisting. The air changed, charged with something raw and alive. Xavier's voice was rough when he spoke again. "I don't need pity. I just need someone to believe that I still have something left to give." Aisha's hand rose, almost instinctively resting against his chest. Beneath her palm, his heartbeat stumbled, unsure of its rhythm. "Then, let me believe for you," she whispered. For a moment they just stood there, two people balanced on the edge of something they couldn't name. Then he leaned forward, slowly, carefully. The kiss came not as a spark, but as a surrender, a soft, trembling confession in the language of skin and silence. His hand brushed her jaw. Hers curled into his shirt. The world outside blurred into streaks of light and rain, as if even New York itself had decided to hold its breath. When they finally broke apart, the city was still. Aisha's eyes searched his, not for promises, but for truth. She saw the battle there, the man who wanted to reach for her, and the man terrified of what that meant. "We should go," she murmured. He nodded, but neither moved. Instead, Xavier turned back to the window. The rain fell harder now, streaking the glass in crooked lines of silver. "Funny," he said after a long pause. "I spent years building walls so no one could see inside. And somehow you found the one window I forgot to close." Aisha smiled faintly, her reflection shimmering beside his. "Maybe it wasn't an accident. You think this tonight was meant to happen? I think some collisions are too perfect to be coincidences." She gathered her coat. "But you're still afraid, aren't you? Every second." She met his eyes steady. "Good. Fear means there's something worth losing." And then she was gone, her footsteps echoing down the hallway, leaving him alone with the rain and the echo of her words. He stayed long after watching the lights flicker across the Hudson. The coffee on the table had gone cold. Her scent still lingered, faintly floral, unmistakably alive. He touched the glass where her reflection had been tracing the outline of where her hand might have rested. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man defined by what he couldn't have. He felt like someone standing on the edge of possibility, and that somehow was more terrifying than failure. Down on the street, Aisha stepped into the night rain, pooling around her shoes. Her heart was unsteady, torn between sense and something dangerously close to longing. She shouldn't have let it happen. He was her boss. He was complicated. He was everything she'd sworn to avoid. And yet the memory of that kiss pulsed like a secret under her skin. She looked up. 92 floors above the lights were still on. "Damn it," she whispered to herself. "Don't make me believe in you." Back in the tower, Xavier sank into his chair, running a hand through his hair. On his desk lay the blueprints for Sustainable Horizon. In the corner of one page, her handwriting curved neatly, "Where light enters, life follows." He closed his eyes. She was right. Light had entered, and now he would have to decide what to do with it. Outside, thunder rolled over the city, soft, distant, like a warning. Summer arrived softly that year, like forgiveness. When the invitation came to visit the Sterling development site in the Hamptons, Aisha had hesitated for all of 3 seconds before saying yes. Professional reasons, she told herself. A project inspection. But deep down, both of them knew what the trip really was, a chance to step outside the glass walls of New York, outside the boundaries they'd drawn, but had already begun to cross. The ocean greeted them like an old song, wind-tossed, infinite, untamed. The Sterling villa stood alone on a dune, its walls of glass capturing every movement of the waves. From the terrace, the world seemed washed clean. Aisha wandered barefoot along the veranda, the hem of her linen dress brushing her ankles. The air smelled of salt and cedar. Behind her, Xavier watched from the doorway, his jacket slung over one arm, his eyes following the curve of her silhouette framed by the sea. She turned at the sound of his footsteps. "Beautiful, isn't it?" "Yes," he said. Then after a beat too long, "But not the view I'm looking at." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "You shouldn't say things like that." "Why not?" "Because if you mean them, it's dangerous. And if you don't, it's cruel." He stopped beside her, the last rays of sunlight catching in his hair. "I've been cruel before. I don't want to be anymore." Her smile faded. For a moment, the only sound was the sea, restless and honest. As twilight deepened, they sat on the deck overlooking the water, a bottle of wine between them. The conversation moved like the tide, advancing, retreating, finding rhythm. "You know," Xavier said quietly, "I used to think love was a luxury I couldn't afford, that it belonged to people who hadn't been broken." Aisha tilted her head, her gaze tracing the horizon. "And what do you think now? That maybe it's the only thing that makes the rest of it worth surviving?" He looked at her, then really looked, and for the first time, she didn't look away. "I used to think love was for people who'd never been scarred," she whispered. "But maybe it's the scars that make it real." Night fell completely, and the villa glowed like a lantern against the dark. Moonlight spilled through the open windows, painting the room in silver. The air carried the steady rhythm of the waves, rising and falling like breath. Aisha stood by the glass doors, her reflection flickering between shadow and light. The wind tangled her curls as she watched the ocean's pulse. Xavier moved behind her, slow and deliberate, until his presence was a warmth at her back. His hand brushed her shoulder, tentative, reverent, as though he feared she might vanish. "If love comes for me," he murmured, "I don't know if I'll have the courage to let it in." "Then maybe love doesn't need courage," she said softly. "Maybe it just needs someone willing to stay." She turned toward him, and the space between them dissolved. What followed was not urgency, but surrender. The world outside the villa disappeared. No walls, no rain, no cities watching. Only breath skin, and the fragile miracle of two people who had forgotten how to feel finding their way back. He touched her, as if memorizing, not claiming. She kissed him like someone learning a language she thought she'd never speak again. The night wrapped around them, quiet and infinite. Later, tangled in the sheets, Aisha lay against his chest, the slow beat of his heart steady beneath her ear. The sound mingled with the hush of the waves. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. "The sea. It's full of every river that ever cried," she said. "But no one calls it weak." Xavier's fingers moved through her hair, tender, thoughtful, because it knows how to keep the light in every drop. She smiled, eyes heavy with sleep. "Maybe we could learn from it. Maybe we already are." He kissed her forehead, and for the first time in years, sleep found him easily. But Aisha lay awake long after his breathing evened out. The moonlight glowed across the sheets, soft as memory. Her hand drifted to her stomach, a faint, instinctive gesture she didn't yet understand. Something had shifted. Something alive. She didn't know it yet, but in that quiet room by the sea, the rhythm of her heart had already changed, echoing not one heartbeat, but three. Outside, the waves crashed softly against the shore, as if the world itself had leaned close to listen. And deep inside her, three tiny sparks of life began to glow, steady, secret, miraculous. 6 weeks later, the world felt heavier in her hands. The morning light filtered through the frosted glass of the Sterling Tower bathroom, and Aisha Rivers stood motionless, staring at 3 small test sticks lined up on the counter like judges. Each bore the same verdict, 2 clear pink lines. Positive. She had checked once, then again, then a third time, just to be sure. Now her fingers trembled as she whispered to her reflection. 3 times confirmed, and I still can't believe it. Tears blurred her vision. Not from fear, not entirely, but from the sheer immensity of what this meant. For weeks, she'd brushed off the nausea, the exhaustion. She told herself it was stress, long hours, too much coffee. But deep down, her body had already known. Something miraculous was unfolding inside her. And now, undeniable proof lay before her. 3 lives, impossibly tiny, impossibly real. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. The past came rushing in headlines. Gossip whispers that Xavier Sterling, the untouchable billionaire, was infertile. His ex-wife's cruel words had carved that lie into stone. But here she was, holding proof that life had defied every assumption. Proof that something inside him, inside them, had chosen to live. Her knees gave way, and she sank onto the cool marble floor. A sob slipped through her lips, half laughter, half disbelief. The sound echoed off the tiles, small and sacred. She pressed a hand to her stomach, whispering through tears, "It's you. It's really you." The door opened behind her. Aisha Xavier's voice was hesitant, the tone of someone who feared bad news. He had come to ask about the presentation slides, but stopped dead in the doorway. She looked up, eyes red, breath shaking. For a terrifying instant, he thought she was in pain. Then he saw the 3 sticks beside the sink. Time seemed to stop. The air thickened between them. He took one uncertain step forward. "Is that—" "Yes," she whispered. He blinked, disbelieving. "It's real." A laugh broke through her tears, trembling and bright. "More real than anything I've ever felt." He knelt, not because he planned to. His legs simply gave out beneath the weight of it all. His hand found hers, shaking, searching for something solid. "How many?" he asked, voice barely audible. 3. Her word landed like a heartbeat. 1, 2, 3, echoing through him until he couldn't contain it. 3. 3, she said again, the syllable breaking into a smile that was all light and disbelief. He stared at her, at the woman who had walked into his life, with rain in her hair and sunlight in her voice, and felt the ground shift beneath him. He placed a trembling hand on her belly, almost afraid to touch, afraid to break the spell. God, you've brought light into me, he whispered. Her laughter was soft, tear-streaked, infinite. No, she said, covering his hand with hers. We created it. They stayed like that for a long time, two souls anchored by the fragile, impossible promise of what had just begun. When they finally stood, Xavier guided her to the window. Outside, morning spilled across Manhattan, the skyline drenched in gold. The 92nd floor bathed in sunlight, sharp, clean, forgiving. I used to think this tower was my greatest creation, he said quietly. But I was wrong. Aisha leaned against him, the warmth of his hand steady on her back. This is bigger than both of us, she murmured. It's terrifying. Then let's be terrified together. She smiled through tears, her head resting against his shoulder. The city below roared on traffic sirens' ambition, but in that high, glass-walled silence, the world had reduced itself to three new rhythms, faint and fierce. Three tiny heartbeats. Later, when the doctor confirmed it, triplets, Xavier couldn't stop pacing the office. He had faced crises worth billions, lost empires, rebuilt them again. But nothing had ever made him this dizzy. 3, he kept repeating. 3 of them. Aisha sat on the edge of the examination table, one hand on her belly, amused, and moved all at once. You keep saying it like you're negotiating with fate. I just don't understand how. Maybe you don't need to, she said gently. Maybe it's not for understanding. Maybe it's just grace. He stopped pacing, then looking at her the way he used to look at the horizon, before a storm, wary, reverent, undone. You know, he said slowly, I spent half my life thinking I was broken, that I couldn't make anything real, anything that lasted. You were wrong, she whispered. He nodded, eyes glistening. I think I was just waiting for you. That night they returned to the tower. The city lights stretched endlessly below each one, a small declaration of existence. Aisha leaned against the glass, her reflection overlapping with the stars outside. She thought about the months ahead, the scrutiny, the whispers, the inevitable storm when people found out. She thought of her career, her independence, her mother's warning voice. Don't let a man become your gravity. But then she thought of Xavier, the way he'd knelt beside her without hesitation, the awe in his eyes when he felt her pulse. And for the first time, she didn't feel gravity pulling her down. She felt it pulling her home. He joined her by the window, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. Neither spoke. There was no need. The light that poured through the glass was enough warm, endless trembling with promise. Below them, New York pulsed like a living heart. Above them, the night waited vast and silent. And between those two infinities, sky and city power and love, they stood holding on to a fragile, miraculous truth, that sometimes the things you're told are impossible are simply waiting for the right moment, the right touch, the right love to prove otherwise. 3 heartbeats whispered beneath Aisha's ribs, steady and defiant. And for the first time in his life, Xavier Sterling believed not in empire, not in control, but in the simple, sacred act of life itself. News spreads faster than mercy. By the time morning hit New York, the story was everywhere. Glossy magazines, financial blogs, anonymous forums. The billionaire's scandal, she trapped him. A black architect, pregnant with Sterling's triplets, PR stunt. or power play. Every word carved its own wound. Aisha read none of it, but she didn't need to. She felt the judgment long before she saw it in the way the concierge avoided her eyes, in the whispers that followed her down the marble hall. By the time she stepped out of the building, cameras had already gathered like vultures. Flashes erupted harsh and blinding. The noise rose in a blur of questions. Did you seduce him for money? Is this pregnancy planned? Do you have proof they're his? Her stomach tightened beneath her coat. She pressed one hand instinctively over the small swell, her children their miracle, and walked on without answering. Every flash felt like a blade. Every question a cut she refused to let bleed. By afternoon, Xavier's name was trending for all the wrong reasons. His board was panicking, his PR team scrambling. Shareholders demanded statements. He shut off his phone and sat in silence, staring at the glass skyline that once felt like armor and now looked like a cage. His assistant knocked, whispering, "Sir, the press conference starts in an hour. Are you sure you want to?" "Yes," he said. "I'm done hiding." He had hidden behind this tower long enough. If the world wanted a show, he would give them something real. The conference room was packed, the air thick with anticipation and disdain. Cameras, microphones, eyes. Aisha stood beside him, calm on the outside, but trembling underneath. She could feel the collective skepticism, the curiosity laced with quiet cruelty. One reporter rose first. "Ms. Rivers, what do you have to say to the rumors that you manipulated Mr. Sterling for personal gain?" For a heartbeat, silence. Then Aisha stepped forward. Her voice was steady, her hands folded over her belly. "I don't need to prove anything," she said softly, "except that there are 3 heartbeats living inside me right now. They are not a strategy. They are not a scandal. They are life." She paused. "And if love is the crime I'm accused of, then I'll accept the sentence for as long as I live." The room went still. No one expected grace. No one expected her to speak like that, not with pain, but with quiet power. In the back row, Xavier's fingers tightened around her hand. The cameras caught it the way he looked at her, not as a liability, but as something sacred. That night, they went home together. The city outside was dressed in white, the first snow of winter falling slow and soundless. Inside their apartment glowed dimly, the soft hum of the heater, blending with the chaos of the world beyond the glass. Stacks of newspapers lay scattered across the floor, their names printed in bold black letters. Aisha stood among them barefoot, her reflection rippling on every headline. "They make it sound like we did something wrong," she murmured. Xavier approached his tie, undone, his expression weary but unbroken. He picked up one of the papers, read a line, and laughed, not with humor, but disbelief. "They can have their stories. We have the truth." She turned toward him, searching his face. "Do you regret it?" He met her eyes unflinching. "Not for a second. They say I've lost everything: reputation, control, power. But look around, Aisha." He gestured toward her, toward the room, toward the world that now carried 3 fragile lives. "I finally have what matters. A family." Her breath caught. For the first time that day, tears came freely. He drew her close, holding her, as though the whole city might collapse, and he could still keep her safe. Outside, the snow thickened, muffling the sounds of traffic and headlines and judgment. Inside, the only sound left was the steady rhythm of 2 hearts, and somewhere within her, 3 more answering in return. Hours later, when she'd fallen asleep against his chest, Xavier stayed awake, watching the snow drift across the skyline. He thought of the empire he'd built, of how fragile it suddenly seemed. He thought of the whispers calling her unworthy, opportunistic, too different. He thought of how wrong they were. He knew this was only the beginning. The fight to protect her, to protect them, would not end with one speech. But he also knew something the world didn't. He had spent his entire life trying to prove he could create greatness. Now, for the first time, greatness was breathing quietly beneath her skin. In the morning, they woke to a city muted by snow. The world would still talk, still twist, still try to define them. But for now, the white outside felt like absolution, as if the universe itself had decided to rewrite their story in softer ink. Aisha stood at the window, her hand resting on her belly. "They won't stop judging us," she said. Xavier came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her shoulders. "Then let them," he said. "We'll give them something worth watching." She smiled faintly, leaning into him. Outside, snowflakes caught the light, tiny sparks drifting toward the streets below. And somewhere in the city's silence, 3 small heartbeats kept their rhythm, defying every doubt, every whisper, every rule of what should have been possible. The night shimmered like a promise. The Metropolitan Museum of Art, that great temple of time, had never looked more magnificent. The gala, held beneath the ancient stones of the Temple of Dender, was the event of the year. Golden light spilled across the centuries-old carvings, the limestone gleaming like honey beneath the chandeliers. Guests in velvet and silk glided across marble floors carrying champagne and secrets in equal measure. And at the center of it all stood Aisha Rivers Sterling, 5 months pregnant, wrapped in a deep wine-red gown that glowed under the lights like a heartbeat. Her hand rested instinctively on the curve of her belly. 3 heartbeats pulsed hidden beneath silk and satin, but she felt them like a quiet chorus. Every movement reminded her she wasn't alone. She had become a vessel for something larger, hope, life, defiance. Across the room, Xavier Sterling was already on stage preparing to speak. The hum of voices softened into silence as the orchestra's last note faded. The spotlight touched him, illuminating a man who once embodied control and distance, and now stood open, vulnerable, human. He began quietly. 5 years ago, he said, his voice steady, rich, carrying through the ancient hall. I built the tallest tower in New York, a monument to ambition, a testament to power. He paused. The crowd waited, curious. He glanced up, his gaze sweeping over the audience, then stopping, finding her. But tonight, he continued, I realize I never wanted to build monuments. I wanted to build sanctuaries, places where hearts can rest, where people can belong. A murmur ran through the crowd. Some moved, others skeptical. He didn't waver. The woman you see beside me tonight, he said, voice deepening, taught me that greatness isn't measured in glass or steel, but in faith. Faith in others. Faith in love. Faith in the things we can't control, but choose to nurture anyway. The spotlight shifted slightly, landing on Aisha. For a heartbeat, the crowd turned to her, and she felt 1,000 eyes study her, some with awe, some with disbelief, some still with judgment. But Aisha didn't flinch. Her spine was straight, her gaze luminous, her lips curved in a soft, knowing smile. Her past, the whispers, the cruelty, the headlines had all led here. And as Xavier's words hung in the air like prayer, she knew that forgiveness had quietly replaced bitterness. A few rows away, Adriana Blackwood, Xavier's ex-wife, sat frozen, a glass of champagne, untouched in her manicured hand. For months, she had dismissed his new life as a phase of rebellion. But now, as she watched him speak, watched him glow, she felt the sharp sting of truth. She had once stood beside that man and never known how to reach him. Aisha had done in 1 year what she couldn't do in 5, taught him how to believe again. And somehow, instead of resentment, Adriana felt something she hadn't in years: humility. When Xavier finished, the room was silent. No polite applause, no whispers, just stillness. Then, like a wave breaking, came the first sound: one pair of hands clapping, then another, then dozens, then hundreds. Applause filled the temple like music. For once, the sound didn't come from admiration, it came from awe. Xavier stepped down from the stage. Every stride was measured, but his eyes never left her. As he reached her, she stood, and for a moment the room seemed to fall away. The chandeliers, the marble, the power brokers who ruled the city. It was only the two of them, the man who had been broken, the woman who had believed in light. He took her hand. The gold band on her finger gleamed under the glow of the temple's reflection pool. "You shouldn't have done that," she whispered, half smiling through tears. "You'll start another storm." He shook his head. "I've lived through storms," he said softly. "But this time, I want it to be the thunder that clears the sky." Her laugh trembled. "And the board, the investors. Let them see," he said. "Let them know I've chosen something they can't quantify. Let them see what power looks like when it learns how to kneel before love." He placed his palm gently over her stomach. Beneath it, a faint flutter, a response. "Here," he murmured, "is my legacy." Aisha smiled through her tears, her hand joining his. "No," she said quietly, "our legacy." He leaned down, pressing a kiss to her forehead. Around them, applause continued like rainfall after drought. Later that evening, while guests mingled and photographers circled, the two slipped away. They found refuge in the quiet of the museum's rooftop terrace. The city stretched before them, glittering, infinite, alive. Snow from the night before still clung to the edges of the stone balustrade. The skyline shimmered, and for the first time in a long time, Xavier felt peace. "You know," he said, "there was a time I thought faith was for people who'd lost everything." Aisha's fingers traced his wrist. "Maybe that's exactly when it matters most." He smiled. "You make it sound so simple." "It is," she said softly. "Faith isn't about believing in miracles. It's about believing that even when the world doubts you, you can still choose love over fear." He turned toward her. The city lights reflected in his eyes. "And you," he whispered, "chose me." "No," she corrected gently. "I chose us." Inside her, the triplets stirred their tiny movements, like the rhythm of possibility. She placed his hand over her belly again. "They're listening," she said with a small smile. "Then let them remember this," he murmured, "that their parents stood before the world unafraid." The city below pulsed with light. Somewhere, the river reflected the temple's golden glow. Somewhere, the same people who had whispered their condemnation were now raising glasses in admiration, rewriting their stories. But Aisha and Xavier didn't need the world's approval anymore. They had rewritten their own. Back inside, the final toast of the night began. The host spoke about legacy, about power and transformation, but the words faded into background noise. Aisha looked around the room, the same elite who had once sneered, now nodding, smiling, applauding. The same people who had doubted her, now whispering her name with respect. She realized in that moment that forgiveness wasn't surrender. It was sovereignty. When Xavier took her hand again, it wasn't for show. It was a declaration, their story no longer defined by scandal, but by strength. Outside, New York burned bright under winter's breath. The river glittered like liquid gold, and from the museum's windows, the city looked baptized, cleansed, renewed. Xavier turned to her as they stepped out into the cold. "You see that?" he said, nodding toward the skyline. "It's beautiful." she said. No, he whispered, eyes soft. You are. And for a fleeting moment, Aisha believed the entire city might be glowing not from its towers or lights, but from the quiet, unshakable faith that had finally found its place in their hearts. That night, New York didn't just shine, it believed. Morning light spilled across the penthouse like a quiet symphony, soft, golden, alive. It touched the marble floors, the framed sketches on the wall, the half-drunk mugs of coffee. And somewhere in the middle of it all came the sound that rewrote everything, the sharp new cry of life. 3 of them: Atlas, Phoenix, Sage. Each name whispered into the world with reverence, chosen not for beauty, but for meaning, strength, rebirth, and wisdom. The triplets had arrived 3 months ago, early, but fierce, as if determined to prove that miracles did not ask for permission. Now their laughter mixed with the hum of the city below, with the heartbeat of a family that was never supposed to exist, and yet somehow did. Aisha sat on the couch, sunlight brushing her skin, a baby nestled in each arm. The third slept in the bassinet beside her, a fist curled tight, as if holding on to the promise of tomorrow. Across the room, Xavier Sterling stood still, watching. His eyes, the same eyes that once hid behind glass towers and boardroom walls, were soft now, undone by the smallest sounds. He crossed the room slowly, every step measured, like he was afraid the moment might vanish if he moved too fast. He picked up their daughter Sage, cradling her tiny form against his chest. The baby blinked up at him, eyes gray as morning mist. When the world said I couldn't be a father, he whispered, pressing a kiss to her forehead, you became the answer. Aisha's laugh came through tears. And when the world said our love couldn't last, she said quietly, we became the proof. Their eyes met across the sunlight, 2 souls that had once stood on opposite sides of everything: race, power, fear, pride. Now, there was no distance left. Only the fragile perfection of 3 tiny heartbeats between them. The first few months were chaos, sleepless nights, soft cries, and moments so raw they made the world outside disappear. Xavier traded conference calls for midnight lullabies, learned how to warm milk bottles with one hand, and how to hold 3 babies at once without dropping his dignity. Sometimes Aisha would wake in the middle of the night and find him sitting by the window, one child asleep against his shoulder, whispering stories to the city below. He'd tell the babies how he met their mother, how rain had once turned his life upside down and somehow saved it. It was in those hours that Aisha understood what love looked like after all the storms, not grand, not dramatic, but quiet and steady, like light returning after winter. 1 year later, the headlines were different. The Light Foundation launches Sterling and Rivers, champion women of color in design. Aisha stood on the stage of the new Sterling Hall, the crowd shimmering beneath chandeliers. Her red dress flowed like the one from the gala, but tonight, it wasn't about glamour. It was about purpose. Behind her, the foundation's name glowed softly on the screen, the Light Fund. For women who build the world they wish to live in. She adjusted the microphone, looked out at the sea of faces, and began. A few years ago, I believed love could heal every wound, she said, her voice calm, luminous. But love doesn't heal, not really. It transforms. It takes pain and turns it into light so that others can find their way through the dark. The room was silent, breathless. Cameras flashed, but no one spoke. In the front row, Xavier watched her, the same awe on his face as the first day he saw her sketches scattered on a rain-soaked floor. Aisha's voice softened. This foundation is for every woman who was told she couldn't. For every mother who thought she had to choose between creation and career. for every dream that was buried under doubt. Because I've learned, when we build with love, we build something eternal. Applause rose like a wave, filling the room with warmth. That evening, they returned home. The triplets were asleep, their tiny breaths sinking like music. Aisha stood by the window, the city stretching out before her skyscrapers, catching the glow of sunset, their reflections rippling across the Hudson like molten gold. Xavier came up behind her, his arm circling her waist. Together they watched as the light dimmed over New York, the same city that had once tried to destroy them, now bowing beneath their quiet triumph. "You know," she said softly, "there was a time I thought this city would swallow us whole." "It tried," he murmured. "But we built something stronger." She smiled, leaning into him. "A tower." "No," he said, kissing her temple. "A home." They stood there watching, as the last of the sunlight kissed the top of Sterling Tower, his first monument now glowing in the distance. "We finally built the most beautiful tower of all," he said. With what she asked, her voice playful. "With our hearts," he whispered. In the nursery, moonlight brushed across the cribs. Atlas stirred, one hand stretching toward the air. Phoenix made a soft sound, half a laugh, half a dream. Sage, the smallest, slept peacefully, her face serene beneath the mobile that spun tiny silver stars above her head. 3 new lights, born from faith and defiance. 3 small answers to the question the world had once mocked. Can love like this last? Yes. Because love, when it's real, doesn't fade. It evolves. It rebuilds. It survives every storm and comes back brighter than before. Later, as the city settled into night, Aisha wrote the foundation's final motto on the window glass, with a fingertip, the words glowing faintly under the reflection of the skyline. Light never dies. It only finds new places to shine. Xavier joined her, reading the words aloud. Then he turned her gently toward him. "You realize," he said, smiling, "that everything we went through, it wasn't about us, was it?" She looked up at him. "What do you mean?" "It was about everyone watching, everyone who needed to believe that love, no matter where it begins, can still end in light." She nodded, tears slipping down her cheek. "Then let's keep giving them reasons to believe." Outside, the skyline glowed like a constellation reborn. Inside, 3 babies slept. And between them, the 2 people who had defied every expectation stood hand in hand, their reflections framed by the light of the city. They had changed forever. Xavier kissed her forehead, his voice barely a whisper. "We made it." "No," she corrected, smiling. "We became it. If this story touched your heart, share it. Because somewhere out there, someone still needs to believe that miracles are real, and that love once found can turn even the darkest night into dawn."